So welcome, Wisconsin educators. This is the fourth webinar in our five-part series about the 2021 Wisconsin Standards for Mathematics. And as we begin our webinar today, I'd like to share this land acknowledgement. Wisconsin is home to the greatest Indigenous diversity east of the Mississippi River. 12 Indigenous nations, 11 of which are federally recognized, currently live within Wisconsin borders, and you can see them here on the map. As I've mentioned in past webinars, I'm currently on Ho-Chunk traditional land near Madison. The Ho-Chunk Nation's history spans back beyond possibly 3 ice ages, or between 12 and 15,000 years. As the Ho-Chunk Nation's oral history states, we have always been here. An interesting story that I came across in my newsfeed this morning was related to the Ho-Chunk Nation. Maybe some of you have read about it today. A few months ago, a 15-foot long dugout canoe was actually found at the bottom of Lake Mendota. Lake Mendota is one of those 2 lakes in Madison that are one on either side to create that strip of land where our Wisconsin capital is located. The canoe was made of one single tree and was made by members of the Ho-Chunk Nation. It's the oldest intact boat ever found in Wisconsin waters, and carbon dating found that it was indeed 12,000 years old. It's a really interesting story about how that full canoe was found, how actually yesterday they brought it up out of the water, and the Wisconsin Historical Society was taking care to move it and preserve it. It's really an important artifact that was found, and a reminder to us of those original caretakers of the land that I'm on. You can go to madison.com if you want to read any more about that story. So in acknowledging this traditional Ho-Chunk land, I'd like to recognize how important it is that we learn about the American Indian ancestors who enrich our lives and culture here in Wisconsin, honor their past, and continue to listen to and learn from the stories of those who continue to care for the land today. And I know in past webinars, we've shared some ways that you can learn more if you would like to about the land that you might find yourself on. And the one that's here on the slide is the one that I'm going to put in our chat for you. It's different than the links we've been sharing in the past. So try that out. See if you find something new this week that you'd like to learn. And next, we're going to be continuing to share our stories so that you can learn a little bit about Mary and I. Today, I'll be sharing about that magnifying glass symbol that you see near the bottom of the screen about family history. Family history and kind of digging into the past, whether it's recent past or very far long ago past, is really something that brings me joy. I love to, whether it's taking something that's an old possession, like a recipe book from family, and I might, scan it and put it together and preserve it so that we have it for a long time, because pretty soon we won't be able to read the pages, whether I'm just talking to my parents and hearing about how they grew up and the stories that they have to share, or whether I'm actually digging online with my husband and we're researching and doing that genealogy and finding out about our ancestors, from long ago that we certainly have never met or heard of before. It's all just something I really enjoy doing. And when I think about the mathematical connections to that activity that really brings me joy, I see that it's kind of all about the data. I really like gathering the data, organizing the data, and then looking at it to see what kind of story it can tell me by looking at random pieces that we found here and there. It's kind of cool to see how a story emerges, and I really get to know about the family that I've come from, and it helps me to know who I am. And so one of those things that I really enjoy about that process is that organization and putting together data. And I think that's a strength of mine that I can bring to whatever I do, and a way that I can look for kind of the mathematics in other people that I'm with as well. And now I'd like to turn things over to Mary to share a little bit about her story.
Great. Thanks, Julie. This has been an interesting journey, doing a different part of my identity each time we share with you in the webinar. And I really hope that you've been doing this along with us as well to tap into your own stories and think about where your strengths lie. It's been surprisingly a very reflective opportunity even for me as I think about it. So this time I wanted to share with you the picture on the bottom left. That is me. That is me. That is the person in the white shirt with kind of the red skirts outfit on. That's actual picture of me when I was a child, and my awesome Saint Bernard that I love so much. But I think the reason I chose this picture is because there's something on my lap that I made. I made things all the time. I loved making things. I still do. I love crafts. I love doing things. And I think that's what I love about math. It was probably the most active class I had throughout my growing up, because math, you had to do it to understand it. Or at least that's what I believe. I really believe you have to do the math to really understand it. So this strength, it helped me a lot. When I had to do book reports, one of my favorite things was when the teacher offered a diorama to explain our comprehension of the story. That was much more intriguing to me than to writing a book report. So anytime I could make an actual object, I loved it. And I really think this comes through in kind of my philosophy of teaching. I love providing opportunities for students to do the math, because I truly believe that not only will they learn it better if they do the mathematics, but it also gives me an opportunity to watch them learn. I've never felt comfortable standing in front of a room, showing people how I can do math as much as I enjoy it myself. I quickly found out many students didn't enjoy watching me do math. At least that's what they said. They didn't enjoy it. So that was one of the reasons I chose that picture, to kind of tell that little piece of my identity. And this really has been a journey, I think, that we were both on, exploring our own identities and how they impact how we think about teaching from this vantage point at the department. So I hope you've been appreciating the stories, and I'm going to turn it over to Julie so she can continue.
All right, so here we see that we are in webinar 4 tonight, situated in our 5 webinar series, and we are going to be focusing on aligning curriculum to the 2021 standards tonight. And you see here the webinar series objectives. These are the same objectives that we've shared in previous webinars. During today's learning, we'll focus on the 3rd dot point. You see it here. We're going to be considering plans for understanding these revised standards within curriculum and instructional materials. We also hope this webinar inspires you to deepen your understandings of the new standards, and we continue to center Wisconsin students throughout all of the work. And here we have a reminder that this professional learning module can support your own learning by using the slides and slide notes, ideally in a collaborative setting. You might plan for and facilitate learning for your colleagues based on this presentation. When doing so, please make a copy of the slides and modify the slides as needed to support your local needs. And finally, please contact us at DPI with any questions you might have or feedback that you'd like to offer. We really appreciate the conversations that we've had with some of you already based on the learning series. The conversations are really important as we make sense of this new learning together. So please don't hesitate to reach out. And as you plan for facilitating the learning, maybe within your school or your district or your CISA region, remember the importance of forming an inclusive team or asking schools to register for your offering as a team. That includes representation for each and every student. Remember to include classroom teachers, possibly a district math specialist, math coaches, especially those who have expertise with specific students like multilingual students or students with IEPs. This work is all about examining systems and structures to make sure that each and every student can be successful. So it's important that this variety of team members are at the table for the learning. And here you see our outcomes for today. Together, we'll make further connections to our Wisconsin mathematics vision. We'll reflect further on the 5 shifts as they relate to curriculum alignment. We'll work to understand a process for aligning your local curriculum to the 2021 standards, and we'll think how to plan for this sharing with your colleagues. And here we see our norms for collaboration. During today's learning, I'd encourage you to consider which of these norms do you personally struggle with, or which norms are strong for you as an individual. For me, when I look at that expecting and accepting non-closure, sometimes that can be certainly a challenge. I know that we're going to be talking about some things that might be new to you today. So we really hope that you'll leave here having learned something new, but you also might find that you're going to leave here with maybe some additional questions. And that's kind of the nature of how this new learning is going. But if you're focusing on a strength today, think about how that strength might support your team when you go back to your local space and you start doing that collaborative work. And here we see our phase-by-phase rollout. Today's learning will still mostly reside in that phase 1 or that understanding phase. But we are going to be spending a little bit of time as we start to think about how the work of phase 1 might help provide us with the information that we need so that we can start thinking about those action steps related to phase 2. And at this time, let's dig in a little deeper into our Wisconsin vision for mathematics by thinking about another component of the vision. Today, we're going to be looking at that lower left corner. And this component talks about the importance of developing positive dispositions towards mathematics as a way to cultivate self-efficacy and lifelong interactions with math. We know the importance of children feeling that they're part of a community in order for them to fully engage in the work of math learning, and that their identity as a math learner also shapes their willingness and ability to engage in that mathematics community. So it's important that each individual child feel valued and appreciated, which can support them in believing themselves as a doer of mathematics. But it's also important for them to see that each and every other child in their classroom, their classmates, are also valued members of that classroom. So that way this collectively creates that community of doers of mathematics. And when you have time outside the webinar, or if you're watching this as a recording, this is a great time to go ahead and pause, take a few minutes with your collaborative team to consider the question that we have here on the slide. And I'd like to turn things over to Mary, but she needs to unmute herself. There we go.
All right. So we're going to take a moment to step back a little bit and develop some background knowledge about how we are coming to this space to you today. So in particular, in our department, at the Department of Public Instruction, we have been relying on some research, which will be a link in your notes document, as well as I think Julie's going to put it in the chat, about the connection between standards, curriculum, and materials-focused professional learning, and how that relates to student achievement. So that's really kind of the backbone that we have been using in our work around high-quality instructional materials project. So those of you who have been on this journey with us in exploring the selection adoption process for materials that are aligned to the standards, as well as the professional learning that supports that, a lot of the webinar will sound familiar to you. And secondly, I think it's important to think about the role of standards. These are standards that many people, a lot of people on this call, contributed to reviewing and revising these standards. So these standards really are our goals for our students at the end of a grade level or at the end of their high school 3 years of credit mathematics that's required. And then lastly, we think about there is Wisconsin data as a state. There's likely local data in your particular context that shows all students are not achieving a level of mathematics that will support them in either their further grades or in their college career or life goals. So there's a couple of reasons why we do this work. And I want to make sure that we all have that common understanding to that. Now, there is some what this work is, and there is some what this work is not. So the research listed below is, again, some of the research, the studies we're relying on. But this work is considered job-embedded professional learning. This is not really, we did not want to think about professional learning that would be outside of teachers or educators' regular jobs. We wanted to make sure that this was supported by research. And I do want to point out that this is not easy work. So I really appreciate Julie's reflection on the expect and accept non-closure, because this is complex work. What this work is not going to be unpacking the standards. Many of you I know on this call, and I know you're around since 2010 doing that work of unpacking standards. We've moved a little bit since 2010, and we hope that you see those changes in today's webinar. It's also not a checklist. This is not, yes, the standards, the materials are aligned. This is not a checklist type of activity. This requires some complex work in thinking and reflecting about that connection between standards, curriculum, and materials. All right, so this is going to be a little strange because some of you are watching this webinar for your own personal knowledge, and you're going to take this material and you're going to do something with it. But for those of you who are doing this work, it really requires resources. There's a number of resources you will need to participate in the activities that we are going to engage you in today. Some of the things that you will see listed here, this doesn't mean you have to have all of these, but we felt this was a pretty comprehensive list of what would help you do the work moving forward. All right, so I'd like to just talk to you a little bit about our vision. Julie mentioned the vision as a whole, but I want to talk to you about it in terms of a fictitious person. So I've decided that we're going to talk about somebody named Cece, who is a graduate from a Wisconsin high school. This is absolutely made up, so there's no high school attached to this. But I imagine there's some child out there that maybe wasn't always confident in mathematics, but she did notice that she enjoyed mathematics when there's a backstory. Many of our students have some strengths in mathematics that not are always common. But in this case, we have a student who enjoyed mathematics when there was a story to it. After high school, she set off on a 2-year technical college, confident and knowledgeable of what types of problems she enjoys solving. She found an interest in data in probably a really rich course sequence of mathematics in high school. She liked noticing patterns in data, and she liked to wonder about really important issues. And she particularly found she had an interest in forensic science type problems. So imagine the student going through 12 or 13 years of mathematics in a Wisconsin high school. We would like to think that this is what it sounds like for a successful outcome. Someone who really is confident in what they know and do, and has found an interest in mathematics and understand how that's connected to themselves. And I want to take a moment to think about that having a vision is great, and we can all wish for these great ideas for our students, but we know that it's going to take some work in many different areas. And today we're going to think about how the shifts can support examining a lot of systems and structures that really contribute to making a student like Cece be successful. So the purpose of today is to really show how the shifts can be used with respect to the materials or the curriculum. So here we have a graphic that we have just started making. We created this document, and we're thinking this is helping us really think about the relationship to the shifts. So there are a couple important points I would like to elevate in this diagram. And then in a minute, Julie's going to take you through a little bit more deeper dive in the shifts. So the important points here are the students are at the center of this graphic. So this serves to remind us to the connections to our vision and our commitment to the students. The 3 shifts in green, labeled focus, coherence, and rigor, come from our previous 2010 standards. In those standards, the shifts really spoke to the mathematics in terms of focus, coherence, and rigor. In 2021 standards, we kind of want to reframe these shifts about how they can better support outcomes for students. So really thinking about, we're not just teaching mathematics, we're teaching students mathematics. So we want to keep those 2 ideas at the heart of our work, our students and the mathematics. The 2 shifts in blue are the shifts that are unique to Wisconsin. So those help us dig a little bit deeper in what it means to kind of attend to the students. Now, used all together, the shifts can help us think about curriculum, instruction, and assessment, and how those are all aligned to the standards and aligned to the shifts in ways that support teaching students mathematics. And lastly, centering students in our work, specifically in the shifts, can support the work of equity. So in today's session, there should be multiple opportunities for you to think about how to build students' knowledge in mathematics, as well as building confident math thinkers and doers that are going to solve really important problems. And we also want instruction to be grounded in the standards and in the shifts. And we'll talk briefly about that at the end of the webinar. But this is really focusing on this idea of alignment to the materials. And lastly, one additional point I wanted to elevate is this relatively new idea to the shifts that we have briefly been calling identity. So many people, the word identity, I think, is not a very uncommon word. I think we use the word identity. We briefly understand, we basically know what it means, but it's a complex topic. And I specifically want to point out what we mean when we think of math identity. So the first bullet is probably the most easily understood component of identity. And it's the beliefs of oneself as mathematics learners. So how do I see myself as a mathematics learner? But I think it's important to have a pretty broad perspective of what math identity means, because it also includes how educators, their role in developing math identity in students. So students develop their identity as they think about their perception of how others perceive them as a math learner, which is really kind of speaks to the teacher place in my heart, is that I'm creating those opportunities for students to see themselves as math learners. And that's a really important one for us to consider. Also, messaging about test scores, approaches to acceleration, course sequences or pathways, teacher actions, teacher moves, all contribute to how teachers or how students develop their math identity. So I'm going to turn it over to Julie because she is going to lead us in a little bit more thinking about the shifts.
Thanks, Mary. Within the standards document itself, we're reminded that Wisconsin's 5 shifts can serve as a tool that educators can use to identify what's necessary in high quality, standards aligned instruction and assessment. And since the focus of this webinar is about aligning curriculum with the revised standards, it's important for us to consider what it might look like to find these shifts in instruction and instructional materials. So we're going to look briefly at each of the 5 shifts, and we're going to use a sampling of the quotations that can be found in Appendix 3 that we've mentioned in previous webinars. So here we have shift 1, and when we think about our math standards being in service of students, we can really make important connections to this shift number 1 about recognizing, valuing, and fostering mathematical identities in all students. So this is a little different also because we're in a webinar situation, but I'm going to ask you to be a little active with the chat for a moment for these few slides that we're going to go through. And so I'd like to invite you to take a moment right now to read the quote from Julia Aguirre and the quote from Joe Bowler. And I'd like you to pull out, is there a phrase, is there an idea that really stands out to you about what you might be looking for when you're thinking about instruction and instructional materials that would be aligned to this shift of identity? So go ahead and take a minute, share with us what you're thinking in the chat. I see multiple entry points, multiple mathematical contributions, learning and thinking, a subject of growth. Nice, thank you. So already just in looking at two quotes, we've got some really powerful phrases and language that would help us connect to the instruction that we see in our classrooms and the materials that we might be using. And next we have shift number 2. When we think about the standards for mathematical practice, we can make important connections to this shift about students being those flexible users of mathematics who can see how math can be used to understand their world and the world around them. So again, I'm going to invite you to take a few moments. This time we have a quote from Francis Sue and one from NCTM. What comes to mind here as we might look for evidence of instruction and materials being aligned to shift number 2? Somebody anticipated. They already had Math Explorer in there. Love it. Something people do. Yeah, reacting to unfamiliar situations, dialogue, flexibility, adaptation, explore. Again, we are just dipping our toe into thinking about these shifts, but I wanted to give you an idea of the types of things that you can find in Appendix 3 so that as you're really digging in your local school or district, you can see just where some rich conversations might go with some of these phrases and ideas. Let's take a look at shift number 3. So when we think about the content standards, we can really make those important connections to shifts 3, 4, and 5. And shift 3 is about students engaging in math that's focused on developing deep understanding of and connections among math concepts. And here again, we see 2 quotes. What might be something we'd find that would be evidence of focus within our instruction or our materials? Making connections, examples in different contexts, opportunities for transfer, teaching for deep understanding. Now they're coming. Thank you for getting a little bit of a taste for what it might look like to find the shift of focus as we're relating it to students and having that focus in our 2021 standards. And shift 4, again, making connections to our content standards. Shift 4 is about students engaging in coherent mathematics. It's about connecting concepts and math thinking within and across domains and grades. Let's take a look at these 2 quotes. Math making sense, the elegance of math. Purpose and connectivity. Finding equity and culturally responsive teaching. Intentionality, making sense, a progression. Tapping into knowledge and experiences. Thank you. And finally, let's take a look at shift 5. Again, closely related to the content standards, shift 5, about students engaging in rigorous mathematics, focused with equal intensity on developing conceptual understanding, procedural flexibility and efficiency, as well as application. And so let's take one look at these last 2 quotes. What might it look like to find rigor within our materials and our instruction? Again, we see sense making, conceptual understanding. And we certainly see that these 5 shifts aren't separate. They are intertwined and related as well. We're seeing some of the similar ideas with a slightly different twist to them. Use procedures meaningfully. Build for conceptual understanding, depth of thinking. Continually challenge students to broaden their perspectives. Well, while we've used some of the ideas from Appendix 3 in these last few slides, we've just really begun to think about how the shifts show up in instruction and instructional materials. So you can see why it's good that we have kind of this 1 year for phase 1, where we really can take the time for understanding. While the standards themselves haven't changed dramatically, the shifts, especially our 2 new shifts in Wisconsin, need some learning and reflection to really do them justice. And at this point, if you're watching the webinar recording, this would be a good time to pause and consider the following tasks and questions to dig in a little deeper with Appendix 3. And now I'd like to turn things back over to Mary.
Again, I was muted. After a year and a half, you think I'd be better at this. All right. In a minute, we'll be sharing a process for alignment, but this isn't the first time that we're probably thinking about standards alignment. At some point, most of you have thought about aligning materials to the standards, possibly once, twice, or even 3 times, given that it's been 11 years since we had new standards. We know there are various tools that exist to determine whether the materials are aligned to the Common Core State standards. So probably the first that was out there was called the Instructional Materials and Evaluation Tool, otherwise known as the IMET. This is really the basis of ed reports, which Wisconsin has really been leaning on to signal what it means to be materials aligned to the standards. We understand that there's another tool is NCSM also has a tool for alignment. So both of those tools work well with the Common Core State standards and really will have some connection to the work that we're doing moving forward in alignment. To determine if the materials are aligned to Wisconsin standards, we can start with these tools, but we will need to add additional Wisconsin specific criteria that can be found in Wisconsin's key shift for mathematics. So the activity that Julie just took you through is one way to kind of get your brain going and think about how would the Wisconsin specific shifts show up in materials. Important to this work, I think many of you mathematicians in the call tonight will appreciate that there is this definition work we need to do. We really need to think about when we say common phrases, such as academic standards, what does that mean? So in this case, academic standards really appear or really are defined as a set of outcomes that we expect at the end of a year. So in K-8, that's exactly what they are. Every grade has a set of standards that could be synonymous with the word outcomes. The high school works a little bit differently. Those are outcomes, but they are really expected at the end of 3 years. And there's considerable work that districts need to do to kind of think about how those outcomes appear in courses. So there's just that added step that high school will need to do for the standards. Next is the definition of curriculum. So as you read through this definition, know that this is probably one of the more difficult words to define. In many districts, there are curriculum, but not all of the components are there, or they might be, some of them might be in hard copy, some of them might be kind of embedded in a culture of how things happen in a district. It's important for teachers and educators to have access to all of the components, both for instructional purposes and their materials when you're thinking about the alignment process. And we spoke to this, if you remember, Julie was talking about instruction and instructional materials. So when we think about instruction, I always think about this is where the teacher work shines. This is where the magic happens. This is where the adaptations and the changes occur in how students kind of receive the message or engage in the instruction. Every year, every teacher has a brand new set of students, and this is where things change the most, is in instruction and instructional practices. This is also why, despite having similar materials from classroom to classroom, instruction will look very differently. So this is the art of teaching, kind of lives in this world of instruction. That is important to have those rich conversations, as Julie referred to, as part of the alignment process as well. And lastly, instructional materials. So if we think about the broader definition of curriculum, this is part of that. So can the question I always ask is this: can instructional materials be considered curriculum? And the answer is possibly. There possibly could be a very strong connection between what you consider your instructional materials in your local context and what curriculum is. And this could be an important conversation to also have before you do the alignment work, is what is the relationship between that definition of curriculum and the definition of instructional materials in your particular context. So we do want to kind of make you think about, there is some there's some pre-work that really needs to be done to this alignment process. And while this webinar is aligned to the standards, we appreciate that there are other components to consider as well. So here I'd like you to think about your vision, your math instructional vision. It could be your own personal vision. It could be a vision you have for your classroom, or your school or district might have a math instructional vision. So one component of the math vision that Julie and I use is that we really think about everything in terms of this vision. We like to go back and revisit it. And we spoke a little bit of the connection of the shifts and how the shifts are the evidence of our vision. So really think about, what does your community believe about mathematics in your vision? And here we have an opportunity to stop and pause the webinar, if that's how you're viewing this, and to think about these two questions relating the vision you have and the materials that you currently are working with for students. All right, I'm going to toss it over to Julie. So she's going to talk through the process that we have developed throughout this webinar for you.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. In this next section, we will be outlining a process for aligning your local curriculum with those 2021 Wisconsin standards for mathematics. And it's important to realize that we're not doing unpacking, as Mary had said a little bit ago on another slide, because we're not unpacking in isolation. With this new standards adoption, instead, we're going to be thinking about a collaborative process where we can analyze the standards in the context of your local curriculum and your instructional materials. So in the process, we'll consider the importance of scaffolding each and every student to proficiency in grade level standards. We'll analyze units of instruction against those revised standards, and we'll record the findings so that we can use that information as we prepare to take actions in phase 2 of the implementation process. And to engage in reflection and analysis of the standards within your curriculum, you're going to have to start by identifying what are the key components of your local curriculum. So your local curriculum may include all of the components you see here on this slide, or you might only find some of the components. Often unit or chapter narratives can be found at the beginning of units or chapters in those instructional materials. And they're often a place where the author has kind of woven together many aspects of the shifts and have really helped to bring a lot of that together in kind of one place. So that's a place where you might find some important insights about alignment, assessments, teacher guide notes, sometimes called wraparound, as well as a scope and sequence, are other examples of components that you might want to bring into the process as you're analyzing and considering alignment to the standards. Mary, would you like to speak to the course sequences in terms of high school?
Yeah, so I just want to add, there is a special component to think about in high school. What Ed Reports does is they will not review one particular course book. They will review a course sequence. So typically the two biggest choices right now are kind of like, do you have an integrated approach in years 1, 2, 3, possibly 4, or do you have what is called the traditional algebra, geometry, algebra 2 sequence? I think it's important to think about the sequence as you examine your curriculum, and you don't do this work in just living in an algebra course or in year 1. You really need to think about the biggest picture that you can in the high school process.
So the main goal of this alignment process is to better understand your curriculum through the lens of the 2021 standards. And we suggest that you consider a unit by unit reflection so that you can think about where there's already alignment there and where modifications might be needed. So one example of a simple tool that you might consider using would be the one you see here, Model 1A. The tool simply lists the 5 shifts and gives you room to record connections that are found. So for example, a team of grade level teachers might complete a unit of instruction. And while the teaching and learning are still fresh in their mind, they're going to take the time to think about each of the shifts and write down the evidence that they find of where there's alignment, or if they have some noticings of where something might be missing, that could also be noted. And then the process is repeated after each unit is completed throughout the school year, helping to make sure that the specifics that are noticed in the moment aren't lost. And then considering Model 1A, it might be a tool that would be especially helpful if you're new to thinking about the shifts. And as you can see by the logo there, we've borrowed this from our partners at Teaching Lab. They've been doing some work with some of our districts in Wisconsin and have had that reflection tool. And we thought it was a great one to bring in as a tool that might be valuable to you. Another option is using a more detailed tool like the one you see here. And we're calling this Model 1B. Again, it's a unit by unit plan. And the shifts are still incorporated into this analysis chart, but they're interwoven with the idea of the standards as well. So after a unit would be completed, the first column would be a place where you could document how you find focus, coherence, and rigor, and how those shifts support mathematical identities for students. And this is a place where that learning that we just kind of experienced a snippet of, where you're digging into Appendix 3 and really thinking about student identity, can come into practice as you're looking for those look-fors in your curriculum and making note of them here. This is also a column which would be a great place to kind of name those content standards that are important to that unit and to consider how the 2021 versions of those standards may impact alignment. So a reminder that this is a great place to take those comparison documents that were shared in both webinars 2 and 3 for our K-8 and our high school standards, so that you really could kind of put them side by side and be able to remind yourself where the standards have remained the same and where there have been revisions. And then column 3 is a place to record the elements of instruction that you find that are evidence of that alignment to the standards. So it's not just about looking at the standards themselves, but thinking about that curriculum as Mary defined it as a whole, which would include the instruction as well. And this is definitely a more complex tool, but it really can provide you with some of that further detail that's really going to make a difference when you start making your plan for action in phase 2. This would be, and I guess I didn't think to mention, so both Model 1A and now Model 1B could be considered kind of like a cover sheet for each unit, if that's a way to kind of wrap your head around what this might look like. And so by completing one of these models for each unit as teachers complete them and process what they've just gone through and the teaching and learning that's happened with their students, they can kind of take note of that and end up at the end of the year with cover sheets for each unit. And Mary, I'm going to throw things back to you. You had another high school connection you'd like to make.
Yep, thanks, Julie. There's always questions. I noticed there was one in the parking lot too about how do the standards fit in the courses in high school. So I think this would be a good time to bring up that the department does not have any plans to tell districts where to place the standards. You can imagine that we do have the first 2 years of the standards. That's important to think about as you're examining your curriculum and your course sequences. That's not set in stone. So there could be instances where a first 2 year standard could show up in a third year book, in an Algebra 2 book, or vice versa, where there could be a standard that is not labeled F2Y that could show up in the first 2 years, and that's okay. These are guidelines that the writing team has put out, but these are not in any way required. This also speaks to the question that comes up around acceleration. So the standards, the way that we have communicated the standards is that we have placed them into kindergarten through 8th grade. And that would be where those standards would live. And then after 8th grade is when the expectation a student would be engaged in the foundational standards or the F2Y standards. That being said, the standards could happen in a different way in your district. So that is something to think about, especially those of you who have some accelerated programs. This tool might not look that simple in middle school or in high school. So you may have to change to your local context to think about how the students are getting access to the standards. I think this is the right place to bring it up, but just know that all of this really is suggested ways to look at an alignment process, but knowing that every single district probably has a different process in place to provide opportunities for the students in mathematics.
And this slide helps kind of illustrate a point that I mentioned a little earlier, but that idea of using those comparison documents that we have provided you with during the webinar series to really look at the previous 2010 standards compared to the revised standards, so that you have an easier time determining, since I'm assuming that materials you're using are probably going to be referencing the 2010 standards. So that lets you at a glance kind of take any unit that you're working with and think about the standards that you're finding there, and kind of in the moment see if there are modifications that might be necessary based on the revisions. Again, you can find those in the public folder in webinars 2 and 3. And since I kind of was out of order there, Mary, is there anything you wanted to add here about high school as well?
Yeah, I think the piece to this part to remember is that we still have the cluster statement. So if you remember, the cluster statements are a summary statement of standards that would appear below it or within it. In high school, there are times where part of a cluster of standards will appear in an F2Y situation with the expectation of this would be great to have in your first 2 years. And this standard might happen afterwards. So just pay attention, that might happen. Not every cluster, the clusters can be spread out over 3 years. They're not necessarily all in the first 2 years or all in that third year space.
So once your team has completed its unit by unit analyses, there's one additional step that is important to this process. And we're calling this now Model 2. And the Model 2 that you see here is an example of what an end of the year analysis might look like. We know that some of the shifts may not fully show up if we're only looking at one unit of instruction or materials at a time. For example, coherence is something that can be found within a unit, but it is also something that we find across domains and throughout the year. Rigor is another example. You may not find that balance of conceptual understanding, procedural flexibility and efficiency, and application all within one unit. So it's important that we take the time after we've done that unit by unit analysis to kind of look at those cover sheets and get a sense of the year as a whole. So we can also look from that vantage point when we're considering whether or not the materials and curriculum are aligned. So again, we're going to be looking for kind of that alignment unit by unit. And then the second part of that process would be looking at the end of the year. All right. And we want to acknowledge that this learning is new for all Wisconsin educators, and each school or district is in a very different place. So while we've shown you 2 examples of what kind of a template or a model might look like for doing that unit by unit analysis, and one model for the end of the year, we want to encourage you to use a process that works for you locally. So it's important that you consider that local vision that Mary mentioned earlier. Think about the materials that your school district has already adopted, or possibly your local initiatives if they might impact this work. But please modify any of these models to better meet your needs, or put 2 different models together, come up with additional columns, whatever is going to help based on your local situation. So basically, start with maybe what we've got here, but go ahead and modify as needed so you have the information that will be most helpful to you when you get to the end of this phase of the work. And here are some sample questions that you might find helpful to scaffold that unit by unit or the end of the year analysis. So we're going to kind of leave these with you to look through with your teams. Some of the ones that I think are very powerful that we might not have already said throughout the webinar would be kind of, what does proficiency and standards look like in this unit in particular? Because we're not always teaching to the entire standard in every unit. We know that standards are end of the year expectations. So taking into consideration, at what point, what does proficiency look like now would be important. What does this unit of instruction say about what you value in mathematics instruction? Again, connecting back to your local vision, and what might be the priorities of the modifications when you're thinking about the possible modifications that happen. We know everything can't happen all at once. So it will be important that kind of after that end of the year reflection to use whatever you've got in those end columns as possible modifications to prioritize and make some plans. What's most important for us to do right away, and that will help in creating that timeline and that plan for you and your district. And so to recap the phase one process that we've outlined today, it's really about completing multiple unit analysis and then doing those one at a time right after the completion of a unit. The process includes an end of the year analysis using the information recorded on those cover sheets. And then it also includes a chance for you as a team to reflect on your district's readiness for phase two action. Everybody, again, is going to be at a different place in this process. So when you kind of think back and look at the work that you've done, when you feel that you have the information that you need to be ready for action, then it's time to move to phase two. And Mary, if you'd like to let us know what you're thinking about the examination of course sequences and that high school perspective again, please.
Yeah, I think this is a good time that we are in this reflection mode in this phase one to think about how the materials are aligned, is that you also think about how the course sequences are aligned. Is it really the right sequence for the students? In high school, we have an odd situation where we don't know what the next experience in mathematics are going to be. I think you can all understand that a sixth grader is going to go to seventh grade math. We don't have that after a 3-year sequence of mathematics in high school. We have to think about what might a fourth year look like, and we need to think about what happens after the student graduates. So these are all possible areas that you want to consider while you're thinking about this alignment process.
So we know that this phase one process is truly a commitment that a district makes to tackle the important and complex work of standards alignment or alignment to the standards. So this would be a great time to pause the webinar if you're watching a recording and consider, what that commitment might look like and have a conversation so you can really think about the reality of how to put this work into place. And back to Mary to take us to the end.
Great. All right, thanks. This is a good time to really reiterate the collaborative notion of this. Here at the department, we have been collaborating with the ELA team and with special ed teams as well to think about how to better support our students when they're on their learning journeys. So given that our state vision is that all students have access to opportunities for success, we need to think about what is getting in the way. What are the barriers? And barriers really is a concept that we have leaned into from the ELA and the special ed world. So we're going to take a moment to think about what are the barriers to student learning and eliminating those barriers. This is an important mindset shift that we may have to make when we also think about building positive math identities. So I would suggest that you refer to your local vision for math instruction. Do the goals for the student learning in the curriculum reflect your local vision? How do they contribute to students being college and career ready? Do the goals allow for students to explore personal interests in areas of personal inquiry? Barriers might actually be in the instructional materials themselves. How are the student identities represented? Are there multiple means of representing the content? Barriers to learning could be in the instruction. Are there access points for all students? Are there scaffolds to support the learning of every student? Is every student able to attain proficiency in the grade level standards? So barriers to learning can be also eliminated through the work of aligning the standards or aligning the materials. And in particular, I want to elevate 2 areas that we really think a lot about at the district being connected to this work is the universal design for learning. All of these are live links that you can learn more about this. Chances are there's a special educator in your world right now that has been engaged in the universal design for learning and thinking about eliminating barriers. Also, the culturally responsive practices are necessary for this work as well. We all know that students come to us with multiple identities, and some of those identities we actually need to kind of learn a little bit more about. This is the will, feel, skill model that is really the basis for our culture responsive work in Wisconsin. So I wanted to make sure that we left you with these resources as well, as they all contribute to a holistic approach to aligning our work to the standards. So we put this slide in. Remember in the beginning, I am all about the experiential learning process. So I hope that wherever you are, whatever space you're in, you take a moment to actually look like or try this out. See what it looks like. Grab some materials. Illustrative Math and Engage New York both have open source materials that you could try this out on. And we hope you do that. And I also want you to think about now, how will you share this with colleagues? This could be formally, this could be informally. So I would encourage all of you to think about now that you, first of all, appreciate all of you that you attended this on this little chilly evening that we have, that you're spending it virtually with Julie and I, but that you think about now, how will you take this knowledge and share it with someone else? And we have one more webinar. And I'm excited for this one because you will not have to listen to Julie and I, which might be a good thing, might be a bad thing. But you're going to hear from our community, our professional organizations, and how they are also supporting the work of the Wisconsin 2021 standards. So we're super excited for that one coming up. And we also have, I think it's 2 more virtual office hours that you could attend. Those are 3 more. Good at my subitizing, I could read that 3 right away. So 3 more opportunities where you could just click on that link and hang out with Julie and I for an hour, ask us questions, have a conversation, whatever you want to do. And likewise, you can always get a hold of us at our emails as well. I always say that I enjoy emails with questions from the field. And I'm excited every time we've given a webinar, I've had at least 1 email. So that's a good thing. So we're going to end the recording now.